At 62 years old, she stood in a small airport arrivals hall in the central Philippines, watching her husband of 11 months embrace roughly 15 relatives in the span of about 4 minutes. And she remembers thinking, with a mixture of genuine joy and quiet terror, that she had just left an entire life behind, based on a relationship that, by conventional measures, was still relatively new. This is her story, and she wanted it told honestly, including the parts where it very nearly did not work at all. She had been widowed at 57 after a 31-year first marriage and had spent the following 4 years in Sacramento building what she described as a genuinely stable, if somewhat solitary, life. A small circle of longtime friends, a part-time position at a local library that she had taken more for the social structure than the income. A routine she had grown, if not entirely satisfied with, at least comfortable inside of. She met her second husband through an online forum focused on genealogy research, a shared hobby that led to months of correspondence before either of them raised the possibility of anything beyond friendship. He was 66, a retired provincial government employee, widowed himself, living in the town where he had been born and had returned to permanently after his own wife passed. Their courtship, conducted almost entirely through video calls and a handful of visits over roughly 18 months, was, by her account, more genuinely thorough and deliberate than the courtship of her first marriage had been at 26, when she admitted she had made that decision with considerably less self-awareness than she brought to this one. The decision to relocate, rather than have him relocate to Sacramento, was, she wanted to clarify, not automatic or assumed. They discussed both options extensively. He had, in fact, offered genuinely and repeatedly to consider moving to California, and she credited that offer, and the fact that he meant it sincerely rather than performatively, as one of the specific things that convinced her the relationship was built on genuine partnership rather than an expectation that she would simply follow him. Ultimately, the decision came down to a fairly direct comparison. Her own family, 2 adult children and their families, were spread across 3 different states already, none of them in California, meaning her existing life did not actually offer the geographic proximity to family that might have made staying the more obvious choice. His roots in his hometown, by contrast, were considerably deeper and more actively maintained. A large extended family that gathered regularly, land that had been in his family for 3 generations, a specific and irreplaceable social position within a smaller community. When she laid both realities next to each other honestly, moving made more practical sense for what they both actually wanted their remaining years to look like. She sold her house in Sacramento, a process that took nearly 5 months longer than anticipated due to a complication with the title that she described with some remaining exasperation in considerable and unnecessary detail. She arrived in his hometown, a municipality of roughly 22,000 people in a coastal province, with 2 suitcases and what she now recognizes in retrospect as a somewhat naive assumption that her new husband's family would function socially in a manner reasonably similar to a large American family gathering, simply with different food and a warmer climate. Before we get into what she discovered was actually quite different, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Every week on this channel, we share real, honest stories of Americans starting over overseas. Not the polished version, the honest one. Subscribe now so you never miss one. The first genuine difficulty arrived within her first month, and it centered on a specific cultural dynamic she had not adequately prepared for, despite considerable research beforehand. Extended family in her husband's hometown functioned less like the occasional gathering model she was accustomed to, and more like an ongoing, near-daily social and financial ecosystem, one in which decisions she considered private and belonging solely to her and her husband were, in practice, discussed, weighed in on, and sometimes gently contested by a wider circle of relatives than she had anticipated having any involvement at all. She specifically recalled an early disagreement over a household purchase, a relatively minor one, that within days had somehow become known to and commented on by several of her husband's siblings, in a way that left her feeling, in her words, considerably less private than she had expected marriage in this context to be. She wanted to be careful in describing this, noting explicitly that she did not consider it a negative cultural trait, simply a genuinely different operating system for family life than the one she had spent 62 years inside, and one that required real adjustment rather than simple tolerance. The adjustment period lasted, by her own estimate, close to a year, and she credited a specific turning point to an extended conversation with her husband's eldest sister, a woman roughly her own age who had, it turned out, experienced something structurally similar decades earlier, having married into a family in a different province before eventually relocating back. That sister explained, patiently and over the course of several conversations, that the involvement she was experiencing was not a lack of boundaries so much as a fundamentally different definition of where the boundary of the immediate family actually sat, one that included considerably more people, by design, as a form of built-in support rather than intrusion. Once she began to understand the underlying logic, rather than simply experiencing the practical effect of it, she found herself able to engage with it more on its own terms, rather than measuring it constantly against an American framework that, she came to realize, was not actually the neutral or default standard she had unconsciously been treating it as. What ultimately shifted her relationship with the extended family from tolerance to genuine warmth was a health scare roughly 14 months into her time there, a fall that resulted in a fractured wrist requiring surgery. The response from her husband's extended family, she said, was the specific moment everything she had found overwhelming about their involvement reorganized itself in her understanding into something considerably closer to genuine devotion. Multiple sisters-in-law took rotating shifts, helping with meals and household tasks during her recovery, entirely unprompted and entirely without any expectation of reciprocity being discussed. Her husband's youngest brother, with whom she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words total in the previous year, drove her to physical therapy appointments 3 times weekly for 2 months, declining gas money each time with what she described as genuine, slightly offended confusion that she would offer it at all. She said that experience specifically, being cared for by people she had, only months earlier, found somewhat overwhelming in their closeness, was what finally converted her understanding of the family structure from something she was tolerating into something she genuinely valued, and now, 3 years later, could not imagine having built her remaining years without. She has, over 3 years, built what she described as a specific and meaningful role within the community, beyond simply being her husband's wife. She now tutors English several afternoons a week at the local elementary school, a volunteer position that emerged somewhat organically after a teacher learned of her decades of library work and asked, somewhat tentatively, whether she might be willing to help. She described this role, unprompted, as one of the more genuinely satisfying uses of her time in either of her 2 marriages, a specific and concrete contribution to a community that had, in turn, absorbed her so thoroughly that she was now regularly introduced to visiting relatives not as the American wife, but simply, and without qualification, as family. When asked what she would tell someone considering a similarly significant relocation for a relationship formed later in life, her answer focused less on romantic reassurance and considerably more on practical honesty. She said the version of this story that ends simply with, "never felt more at home," is true, but incomplete without the year of genuine difficulty that preceded it, and she worried that content focusing only on the eventual happy resolution does a disservice to anyone actually attempting something similar, who may encounter their own version of that difficult first year and reasonably wonder whether something has gone wrong, when in fact, by her account, that difficulty may simply be the necessary and unavoidable process of 2 entirely different family systems learning to genuinely integrate, rather than simply coexist. If you are watching this and considering building a life with someone whose family, culture, or hometown operates by rules genuinely different from the ones you grew up inside, she wanted to leave you with the specific reframe that changed everything for her. The discomfort you feel in the first year is not necessarily evidence that the decision was wrong. It may simply be evidence that you are encountering, for the first time, a definition of family larger and more involved than the one you previously operated inside. And that definition, given enough time and enough willingness to actually understand its underlying logic, rather than simply endure its practical effects, may eventually become the very thing you value most. Subscribe to Second Life Abroad and turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone you know who is building a life with someone from a different culture and needs to hear that the difficult first year does not predict the outcome. We will see you in the next one. There is a specific financial dimension to this decision she wanted addressed directly, because she noticed considerable curiosity about it whenever she discussed her situation with other Americans, and she felt most content on this topic, tended to either avoid the subject entirely or handle it with a vagueness that she found unhelpful for anyone genuinely considering something similar. She had, prior to remarrying, consulted an estate planning attorney specifically about how a second marriage later in life might affect her existing assets and her children's eventual inheritance, a conversation she strongly recommended to anyone in a comparable position. She and her husband ultimately established what is known as a prenuptial agreement, one that kept their respective pre-marriage assets, including the eventual proceeds from her Sacramento home sale, legally separate and designated for their respective children, while establishing clear terms for how their shared household expenses and any jointly acquired property would be handled going forward. She wanted to be direct that raising this topic with her husband, a conversation she had genuinely dreaded, was received not with offense but with what she described as visible relief, since he had been independently hoping to raise the same subject and had been searching for a comfortable way to do so. She said the willingness to have that specific, unglamorous conversation clearly and early, rather than assuming love would somehow render financial structure unnecessary, was itself one of the more reliable indicators, in hindsight, that the relationship was built on the kind of practical honesty that has continued to serve them well in the years since. She also wanted to address, directly and without excessive delicacy, a question she said